Opening credits. The story of Russia military. 4 reasons why Russia is losing Ukraine war for now. Written by Roman K. Abramovic. Narrated by Bryce A. D. Payne. Introduction. The story of Russia military offers lessons of failure to avoid. In other words, this book is a how not to guide to leadership and management. Roman describes Putin and the military's use of various strategic concepts, the defense ministry's new equipment and reform initiatives, and Putin's geopolitical quest for influence in the Arctic and Ukraine. Included in the discussions are some of the unintended consequences of his actions: negative world opinion, sanctions, NATO responses, etc. And 4 reasons why Russia is losing Ukraine war for now. 1. Failed communication chain of command. 2. Failed logistical systems. 3. Failed personnel management. And 4. Failed organizational reform. The story of Russia military is an engaging and important history of a reawakened Russian bear and how it currently operates both at home and abroad to ensure Russia is front and center on the world stage. Chapter 1. Failed communication systems. In 2008, the Russian Army's operations in Georgia revealed that the military communications used by the Russian Army had been jammed. The Russian general immediately pulled out his cell phone and called his men, deployed combat operations, and thwarted Georgia's intention to attack. It was at this point that military experts pointed out that Russia could not improve its military communications network to enhance confidentiality and coverage. It will be a great risk in future military operations. By 2022, the Russian military still had not been able to remedy this well-known shortcoming, which ultimately led to the total defeat of the Russian military in Ukraine. In 2009, the year after the Georgia War, the Russian army, under the leadership of Deputy Chief of General Staff Yevgeny Metchik, launched a study on upgrading the military command and control system in order to avoid another hilarious moment of communication failure like the one in Georgia. The communication system is the most important part of the project. This communication system was called the AZART Communication Project, also known as the 6th generation military communication system of the Russian army. The contract for manufacturing the system was subcontracted to a Russian company called Angstrom, whose head was an advisor to the then Russian president Dmitry Medvedev. Angstrom JSC is a Moscow-based company involved in the design and fabrication of electronic products and semiconductors. It produced a range of Soviet-era integrated circuits. After the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, it has produced a line of calculators and bank cards. Russia in 1993, NIITT and Angstrom Factory were privatized as a single company, Angstrom. Sergei Vermienko acquired control over the 3 companies in 2004. In June of 2008, these companies were transformed to a management company, OOO Group Angstrom. In 2008, Angstrom JSC formed a corporate group with an Angstrom T company, and promised to pay its debt of a loan given by a Russian state bank, VEB.RF, if the latter fails to pay it. In early 2009, 50% of the shares of Angstrom and JSC Angstrom M owned JSC Coal Trade and JSC Finance Contract Group were controlled by Sergei Vermienko. 25% belonged through the Rus Electronic Holding Company to the state corporation Rostec and the Russian Federation. 11% were owned by the concern Citronics and 14% by minority shareholders. In August 2009, it was reported that Vermienko planned to transfer its stake in OAO Angstrom, JSC Angstrom M, Renaissance Capital, Federal Property Management Agency, and Management Angstrom in exchange for a promissory note debt, which is estimated at 200 million rubles. In June of 2012, JSC Russian Electronics increased its stake in OAO Angstrom up to 31%. By 2014, it reportedly adopted an insulated gate bipolar transistor technology. In 2017, however, Angstrom T was hit hard by Ukraine-related US sanctions and filed for bankruptcy. In 2018, the VEB.RF became a primary owner of the Angstrom T and started to sell its equipment. It was reported that by the time of bankruptcy, the Angstrom T didn't reach 250 nanometer node processes. The ASART is designed to provide secure communications at tactical levels, even when the adversary uses electronic countermeasures. Moreover, it can be tuned to most frequency bands, including cellular networks, and offers data transfers using the GLONASS satellite navigation system. It conducts data transfers at speeds of up to 7.2 kilobits per second. Reportedly, it has a number of advantages over the system it will replace. These include portability, a user-friendly interface, multifunctionality, and working in repeater mode, with the ability to determine and transmit the coordinates of the location of its users. According to Colonel General Khalil Arslanov, the head of the main Directorate of Communications of Russian Armed Forces, this radio station has been adopted to supply troops and is a radio of fundamentally new generation. A unique technical solution is the pseudo-random tuning of the operating frequencies with a speed of up to 20,000 jumps per second. In this mode, any possibility of technical communication suppression or signal interception is excluded, which ensures the high security of the transmitted information and stability of the communication systems. Arslanov explained that the ASART is designed using modern software-defined radio technology, SDR, adding that this is on equal footing with Western design systems. The most important advantage of using SDR technology is the following: the implementation of new, promising operating modules in the R187P1 radio will be carried out by programs, without changing the hardware platform of the radio itself. That is, the hardware itself will not require either replacement or refinement. New versions of software will be poured into the radio stations, significantly expanding the functionality of ASART P1, added Arslanov. The ASART is certainly proving itself popular based on these characteristics. During combat operations in Syria, for example, Russian Aerospace Forces pilots complained about their existing emergency radios, the R855, saying these lack power for voice communications and specifically requesting the new ASART, which also has the added advantage of encryption. The story is fraught from corruption from the start, with ASART's communications program receiving 18 billion rubles over the life of its project and a total of 60,000 ASART radios produced in Russia by the time of the Ukraine crisis. Thus, the price of a walkie-talkie of this model was 300,000 rubles. However, such expensive equipment did not bring the Russian army the upgraded communication system it had envisioned. The Russian army continued to make the same mistakes as in the Georgia War 14 years ago. Waiting for 2021, ASART's communication project, an even bigger scandal emerged. Arslanov Khalil Abdukalikov, the deputy chief of staff in charge of the project, was arrested. At the beginning of his career, the young man was rapidly moving up the career ladder. He began as an ordinary employee and soon became the chief of communications. In subsequent years, he was the commander of a battalion and a territorial brigade, and served as deputy chief for staff for communications in the Volga-Urals district. At age of 45, the man began working at the headquarters of the ground forces, where he was deputy chief of communications. Then he held a post in the armed forces, headed the communications department, worked in the general staff of the Russian armed forces as deputy chief. By the decision of the head of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, in 2012, he was awarded the rank of colonel general. During the operation in Syria, Khalil Abdukalikov was engaged in the development of communications. He made sure that the commanders were provided with the latest type of communications and worked on testing the means used. The operation was complicated by the fact that Syria does not border on Russia and is in a state of military conflict. The commander's subordinates managed to restore the infrastructure in the belligerent state, primarily the stationary Tetra base stations. Also, Russian operators were involved, which provided communication between the military and relatives. The experience gained was useful to Khalil Abdukalikov after returning to Russia, since it showed what directions of development are needed to improve communication in the armed forces of the Russian Federation. However, Arslanov did not manage to achieve changes, since a black streak of his biography began. In December 2019, the public was stirred up by the news that Colonel General was accused of fraud and embezzlement on a large scale. Information appeared in the media that the reason is directly related to the type of work Khalil Abdukalikov and originates in 2013. Then the head of Vointelecom Enterprise, Alexander Davidov, was arrested. the man was accused of providing the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation with cheap Chinese equipment, which he passed off as Russian and attributed the cost almost 3 times higher than the market. Years after Dave Dov was taken into custody, it turned out that Arslanov was involved in the case. The investigation began in the fall of 2019. During the investigation, the property of the Colonel General was arrested. According to media reports, during a search in the apartment of the military leader's son, about 500,000 rubles were found, and a country house located on the daughter's site in the Moscow region was arrested. Later, the information was denied by the man's heir, who said that the money found belonged to the savings of the Arslanov family. He said that all the real estate was bought on credit and mortgage and there was no house at all. After the interrogation, Khalil Abdulkalikov became ill with his heart, and he was taken to the hospital with suspected hypertensive crisis. For some time, the man was under recognizance not to leave, but soon representatives of the investigation filed a petition with a request to take Arslanov into custody. According to the statement by law enforcement officials, the man violated the conditions of stay under recognizance not to leave. He put pressure on the alleged accomplices and forced them to testify in his favor. At the trial, the Colonel General denied guilt. Alexander Oglobin, former department chief at the Armed Forces General Communications Agency, was charged in a 500 million ruble, $7.3 million embezzlement scheme of state funds earlier this year. Military prosecutors accused him of receiving kickbacks from a friend's contracting firm as a part of a program to digitize the military's secure communication system. According to the Russian trial documents in the Azart communication project, the two men purchased a large number of civilian 65-nanometer communication chips from the wholesale market in Huaqiang Bay, Shenzhen, China, and used them to replace Russian military chips developed in Russia. Azart, some contractor on the project, Angstrom, could only produce chips up to 250 nanometers by 2018, a level of production that was far too low for Chinese companies in Shenzhen. If they do not buy from Shenzhen Huaqiang North wholesale market with Russia's own strength, I'm afraid that the chip problem cannot be solved in the short term. Why does not the Russian army buy some military communications equipment? In fact, Russia bought. Only people did not go to China Electronics Technology Corporation, but to Huaqiang North Trade Market. So, in order to avoid jokes on the battlefield and get Azart communication system, but made a bigger joke, communications were able to cause devastating damage to the Russian military on the battlefield in Ukraine. So much so that a large number of Russian army soldiers took away the phones of Ukrainian civilians and used civilian networks for communication. Ramzan Akhmed Kadyrov is a Russian and Czechian politician who currently serves as the head of the Czechian Republic. Prior to the war, Kadyrov ordered his men to secretly purchase hundreds of Ukrainian SIM cards for battlefield communications. In fact, when many people lamented the fact that the Russian army did not destroy Ukrainian civilian communications, it did not even occur to them that the Russian army itself was using Ukrainian civilian communications for communication. However, when the Russian army uses civilian communications, its battlefield posture is unilaterally transparent to Ukraine. On the one hand, Ukraine can use communication networks for mobilization and buildup. On the other hand, it can use base stations to locate the exact position of Russian servicemen. According to precise information, at least one Russian general was killed as a result. Communication failures of the Russian army on the Ukrainian battlefield are just a replica of the Georgia War. The second problem with Russian military communications is the poor communications interface. In the 2020 Russian plan, the Russian army is to issue new command systems to 45 brigades. In 2020, Russia simply did not complete the task. How much is missing? We don't have specific data, but what is certain is that Russian army units that are fighting in Ukraine have not completed a full replacement of their equipment. And the problem is even more acute in the case of inter-service. Currently, the Russian air and space forces can only operate on their own command and control systems. A large number of units lack the ability to communicate with ground forces. Ground forces can only provide targets but not corrections to strikes. To ensure efficient communications, the Russian military even communicates in plain language over the radio. Such a situation would have been unthinkable in World War II. However, this phenomenon took place in the Ukrainian theater in 2022. For a long time in the beginning of the war, there were a lot of radio enthusiasts. The attack plans and communications of the Russian army were heard on open channels. Russia's communications problems were also made worse by the lack of an overall responsible field commander in the nearly month-long war. CNN 21 reported that US officials were unable to determine who the Russian officer commanding hundreds of thousands of troops fighting in Ukraine was. The large force includes Russia's conscripts, Czechian troops, and the paramilitary Wagner Group, who are fighting mainly in the eastern Donbass region. The Kremlin is trying to encircle Ukraine forces in the east. Russian troops assembled at the border received little warning that they would be sent to fight in neighboring Ukraine, leading to mass confusion in the army and exacerbating the communication challenges for Russian forces. With only 24 hours' notice, there were some things they didn't have time to prepare for, like figuring out which unit they were going to be working with and then exchanging encryption keys for radios so that they could use the encrypted communications, said Jack Waitling, a land warfare researcher at the Royal United Service Institute. That led to the need for them to shout over the intercom, and then everyone from amateur radio enthusiasts to Ukrainian and even foreign intelligence agencies were able to easily eavesdrop on all aspects of Russian military communications. Waitling said, "Obviously, when you hear their conversations, you know they're shocked and don't exactly know what's going on." The leaked military communications have also caused the Russian death toll in the invasion to climb sharply, a figure that has surpassed the combined US casualties in the 20 years war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Ukraine estimates about 15,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded. NATO believes 7,000 to 15,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in the war in Ukraine, said a senior NATO officer on 23.